Hey, Dr. Cluck coming back at you with another financial mathematics video. This one we're looking at yield rates on a portfolio. Let's take a look. So first, the question is, what is a portfolio? And then second, two ways of analyzing portfolios, the dollar-weighted yield rate and the time-weighted yield rate. Okay, so what do I mean by a portfolio? So a portfolio, that's a collection of investments. Could be stocks, bonds, all kinds of things. Loans or savings accounts. I mean, all different kinds of things held by a person or an organization. And typically a portfolio spans multiple market sectors to spread out investment risk. So if you put all your eggs in one basket and that basket, sinks in the ocean, then you're in trouble. So it's the idea of spreading risk around, and hopefully you get, on average do well. Okay. And you could even have in a portfolio things that you own, but also things that you owe. So for example, a liability would be a future debt that's owed. So if you're a company, and you've sold some bonds, well, you've got coupon payments to come up with. So that's liabilities that you have to pay in the future. Now, if you're an investor and you own that bond, then you view that as a positive, ownership or whatever. Okay. And what we want to do with these portfolios is think about how well was it managed. Okay. So that's sort of the key idea that we're looking at. As stocks are bought and sold, bonds are bought and sold. Was the management of that portfolio good or bad, or how did it perform over time? Buy low, sell high kind of an idea. Well, how do you actually quantify that? That's one of the things we're getting at into this section. And an idea to pay attention to: higher yield rates are associated with higher risk investments. If there's if an investment is guaranteed to pay off, it likely would have a very low interest rate. Government bonds, for example, tend to have very low interest rates. But company bonds may have a higher interest rate because there's some risk involved. Maybe the company goes under and you're not sure what you'll get back. So if it does work out, you'll get a higher interest rate, but you might end up with nothing. So that's the idea of the notion of risk and the interest rates. Okay, and the way that's going to play out, that's important to see, is let's say you buy a bond in a company, and that bond is very risky. So maybe it has a 5% interest rate or something, and it's a 5-year bond. And then 2 years into that bond, that company becomes incredibly successful. They've got some product that's, doing really well. Well, that same bond, that you've owed might change. The risk might go then down. And so your bond might sell for more than what you paid for it, because the interest rate is going to be lower because the risk is lower, and so the present value would be higher instead of a lower present value. And so maybe you might sell the bond off before waiting for the redemption, but you've sort of earned all your interest in a short amount of time at that higher interest rate. And so then you got to think about, should you hold it for the long term, or can you get can you get a steep increase in value if you sell it off now that's more valuable than if you waited until the bond reached maturity? So that's the kind of thing. And that's what you would do with a portfolio. Okay, so the next one is the dollar-weighted yield rate. This is one way to measure the performance of a bond or of a portfolio. And what you do is essentially you want to know, if you look at all deposits and withdrawals over a period in a portfolio, and you look at the initial balance and the end balance, right? You want to know what interest rate would take you from the initial balance to the end balance. So it's one interest rate that sort of averages it all out. Okay, so it's the interest rate that if you subjected all deposits and withdrawals to that interest rate over the time period, the individual transactions would accumulate to that. Now, when you buy, then that's a positive. If you take out, that's a negative, right? So you can sort of have pluses and minuses. So in the formula, each M would be a transaction. The CM would be the value of the transaction. So if you bought a bond for 10,000, then that CM would be a 10,000. If you sold something, it would be negative. And then the interest rate is 1 plus I to the TM. So TM would be the time between when that thing was purchased and the end of your account ending value. And so essentially you view all of a portfolio has, all these different things in it. You say this thing costs this much. It's now worth this much. What interest rate would get me there? What interest rate would get me there? And you average it all out, sort of adding it all up. What's the one interest rate I that would sort of get you there? So that's a dollar weighted yield rate. It gives you a way of sort of, measuring the performance of a portfolio all on average over the whole time. Okay. The time weighted yield rate, that one is a measure of the investment's performance. It ignores timing and size of the transactions. So the dollar weighted yield rate is more about what the manager of the portfolio did. This one is sort of more about the things itself as opposed to what the investor actually did. So the key idea is when the time weighted yield rate is larger than the dollar weighted yield rate, then the investor timed transactions poorly. So it's sort of a way of there's two measures of performance, and one of them tells you more what the investor did, and the other one tells you more sort of what the market did. And this one, 1 plus the time weighted yield rate is just the product of the individual performances. So if you take every time a transaction occurs, that's a chunk of time. So you just look at each transaction. First transaction, end balance over start balance. That gives you if it grew, then that number would be bigger than 1. If it shrunk, then it would be less than 1. So end 1 over start 1 is some number, probably close to 1, but hopefully a little bit bigger. End 2 over start 2. Second period, and you multiply all those out. So you've got all these numbers that are, if the values are growing, they're all a little bit bigger than 1, and you multiply them all together. And then that's 1 plus the time weighted yield rate. So if it's going down in value, then you'll get a number less than 1, and the yield rate will be negative. If it's a number bigger than 1, then the time weighted yield rate will be positive. So it's sort of like it's a rate, right? And it gives you a sense of how the investments are performing. Okay, so just a couple final thoughts. This is a more complicated chapter on portfolios because we're not just saying, well, this loan costs this much, right? It's all about bundling all these things together and thinking about, what decisions were made. But I think the exploration will help us sort of get through the nitty-gritty details. We'll work out those formulas and examples, and we'll see you in class, and we'll tackle it then.